Hey guys, can you hear me? I was going to start talking about Bitcoin, but they gave me an announcement just as I came on stage. Unfortunately, if you're standing up, you have to leave because the fire marshals will shut this down. So sorry to be the bearer of bad news. So now, are you guys excited to talk about Bitcoin? I'm really excited. I have 3 of the brightest Bitcoiners on Earth here sitting with me, and I get to ask them anything I like, which is really cool. The first Bitcoin conference I went to, there's a video of it actually of Andreas Antonopoulos speaking in front of an empty crowd, empty audience. And it's just incredible to see so many people and to see Bitcoin's adoption growing and to see so many of you in the flesh. So we're going to talk about what a hyper-Bitcoinized world looks like. And I wanted to start off talking about money a little bit. Money is the foundation of all trade and savings. So it's the most important economic good in any developed society. And a monetary restandardization, the transformation from one monetary system to another monetary system, is a transformational event. Everything will change. Society will be different. There will be winners and there will be losers. So that's the topic of today. And I would love to get this started off by talking about how would you even define a hyper-Bitcoinized world? How would we recognize it? And Saif, I think there's no better person to bring us on board on what that means. So Saif, go ahead.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you for inviting me and for attending, everybody. Thanks. I think, what we mean, there's no clear definition of what hyper-Bitcoinization is, but I guess everybody understands it as a world in which Bitcoin is the dominant money. It's a world in which everybody uses Bitcoin as money. And of course, that doesn't mean that everybody's using Bitcoin on-chain, but everybody's transacting with Bitcoin as their unit of account and as their medium of exchange. And I think a world like that will have very big differences from the world in which we live today. I think the main thing would be, in my opinion, my hobby horse that I always like to talk about is the issue of time preference. I think hard money makes it more likely that you are able to provide for your future self. And so it makes the future less uncertain. And so it makes you think more about the future. Whereas easy money, which loses its value over time, makes the future more uncertain for you, and so makes it harder for you to plan for the future. And so it increases the amount of discounting that you give to the future. So you discount the future more, you think more about the present. And that's what is called a high time preference. So I think hard money and easy money, the most important point as I see it is the implication that it has on human time preference. Because when people have a low time preference, they think more of the future, and all of their activities are geared toward toward the future. Whereas when they have a higher time preference, they focus more on the present, and so they carry out activities that can have negative consequences in the future.
Parker, if you went into a coma now and you woke up 20 years from now, and we were in a Bitcoin world with a Bitcoin standard, what are some everyday things that you think might be different that you'd see if you were walking around?
Well, I really think about it from a fundamental perspective, which is I key in on the pricing mechanism. And I talk about, and I think this is key to your point, which is that a monetary good is the most important single good in an economic structure. And that if I think about the pricing mechanism, which is oftentimes overlooked, it is that a price system only emerges once a large group of people converge on a common form of money, and that money very naturally monopolizes due to its function and due to the problem that it solves. And what's happening right now is that the world is converging on a new monetary standard in Bitcoin, and it's doing so because it has a perfectly inelastic fixed supply of 21 million. And so when I think about that question, I think about it anchored to that point, and that what that ultimately means is that Bitcoin's price mechanism will be more perfect than any price mechanism that's ever existed. And that it will also be one that cannot be manipulated. And that also the most important function in my mind is that the cost of credit The cost of money and the cost of credit cannot be manipulated. So then if I come to your question of what do I expect that future world to look like, you know, it's hard to visualize the specificity, but I'd say the most obvious thing that will happen is that the credit system will be a fraction of what it is today, a very, very small fraction, and that if the price mechanism which money communicates is the primary way that information is delivered to all human beings in the world, that the base money will be communicating that information rather than function of credit, and that when we look back, I think Bitcoin's stability will prove that central banks were the cause of financial instability and financial crisis, and we won't see that anymore, and that history will be written by the winners.
It's a very optimistic answer. Dan, you know, a lot of people are uncertain about how we get to this future, and I'm curious, sort of in broad strokes, how you imagine we get to a Bitcoin standard. What does the transition look like, and what kind of institutions will come on board? What path do we take to get to a Bitcoin standard?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we actually have a very simple answer for it. Number go up. Number go up technology is a very powerful piece of technology. It's the price. As the price grows higher, more people become aware of it and buy in anticipation of the price continuing to climb. This is called FOMO. So Bitcoin has something called like a viral loop. This is a marketing terminology for you tell your friends about a product or service, then they tell their friends about a product or service. And that mechanism is the primary acquisition mechanism during these Bitcoin bull runs that have brought in 10, 100 million users. So this is how Bitcoin will likely continue to gain adoption through these market cycles that we see that occur every 4 years or so. So I think that the simple answer is the price. The price and the price increasing is the metric that defines how many people believe in Bitcoin. When Bitcoin was worth $10 back when I first got into it, there was very few people that believed in Bitcoin, and now it's in the tens of thousands. So that is representative of the aggregate network shared belief in it. And so I think that the price in these market cycles are the way that Bitcoin goes from where we're at now to a billion, multi-billion user world, or multi-billion Bitcoiner world. You know, the transitions to get there on the institutional front, I think, are really interesting. A lot of people go, okay, the institutions are here, that's a great thing, but is that all? Is that it? Institutions bring about more retail adoption. Retail, that's you and me. We're retail traders. And so with institutional adoption, people look to institutions for legitimacy. We may not, but a lot of the world still does. So as the institutions adopt Bitcoin and Bitcoin becomes globally recognized as a store of value or Gold 2.0 asset, then more regular people like us start to believe in it as well. So we're in the very beginning stages of that. The institutions have just arrived and validated Bitcoin as a new emergent gold. And I think that this is a really important moment for Bitcoin. And so in the future, we'll see that continue to climb in adoption in terms of Bitcoin becomes unanimously known as Gold 2.0 or store of value. Ubiquitous terminology for Bitcoin will be like, okay, yes, of course I have Bitcoin, everyone does. So we're in the very beginning stages of that right now.
Safe. Nation states seem fairly antagonistic towards Bitcoin, and understandably so. It's not easy to, you can't debase it. It's very difficult to confiscate. What role does the nation state have under a Bitcoin standard? Would nation states still exist? Would their role diminish? What would the world look like in terms of the nation state?
I think if I were to think about it, I would imagine that it's that the nation state is going to head toward being more of a voluntary association. Rather than the inflation financing governments, in my opinion, what inflation financing governments allows governments to do is to spend first and ask questions and ask for forgiveness later, which works out very well for people in power, but doesn't work out very well for the citizens whose wealth is being devalued from the inflation. So I think a world in which government can't print money anymore in order to finance itself is a world in which it has to take taxes out of you first before it can spend them. And that makes things much more complicated. It's much easier if you can just print and spend than it is to actually try and go and take money from somebody's hand and then spend it. So I think you know, the balance of power that money that is hard creates is much more in favor of the individual. And then governments are going to have to effectively win the allegiance of citizens more convincingly. They're going to have to offer more compelling services and less and fewer bad services in order to be able to attract people. I think political orders would be far more civilized in that there would be less to fight over as well. You know, politics wouldn't be so important and so vicious, both domestically and internationally, because winning your local political election does not allow you to print money. And that's really 99% of the fun if you're into politics. So if you take that away, people are just not going to be so vicious about fighting for politics. I can see the world focusing on more important and more productive things than politics and geopolitics if money is taken out of politics. If what determines the validity of your transaction is, you know, cryptography and the actual possession of the balance, rather than whether you're connected to the right people and whether you have the right people in charge of the bank who lets you pass the transaction. So that's how I see it.
Parker, our economy and the global economy is built on debt, massive amounts of debt. To get to a Bitcoin standard, will there need to be massive debt liquidation? What happens to the economy? What happens to all the people who are holding debt that's denominated in dollars or other fiat currencies?
Well, first, sell all your bonds and buy Bitcoin. And that's financial advice and life advice. But I think, you know, one of the things, and it was part of my path that got me to Bitcoin. The first thing was meeting Saif, and he helped me understand monetary economics. And then I went on a deep rabbit hole down the Fed's monetary system. And when I came up the other side, it was that there's no way out, that there aren't necessarily going to be massive debt liquidations. It's that they're going to, the Fed has a price stability mandate. And that while they don't have an explicit mandate to target asset prices, bonds, stocks, whatever it might be, the credit system has grown so large, it's orders of magnitude larger than the base money, and it is the way that assets and allocations are made through the function of credit, that the credit system is the marginal price setter. So when the Fed has a price stability mandate, it has a mandate to maintain the size of the credit system. And that every time the credit system starts to slow down or even slightly contract, it effectively starts to collapse because of the degree of leverage. And that's what happened last March. That's what happened in 2008. That's why they have to print trillions of dollars. They have to print trillions of dollars, and they will have to continue to print trillions of dollars to maintain the size of the credit system. So the nominal dollars of credit might ultimately pay, but your dollars are going to be worth a very, very small fraction until they're worth nothing. And that's why you should buy Bitcoin.
Good advice. Dan, I was going to ask about the winners and losers in under a Bitcoin standard. I see all the winners in front of me, but who are going to be the losers under a Bitcoin standard? Who is going to come out worse, or do we all come out better?
Well, you certainly want to be holding Bitcoin if hyper-Bitcoinization happens, because Bitcoin will appreciate significantly. You don't want to be holding sovereign debt. You don't want to be holding bonds. You don't want to be holding fiat currency. These will be the losers in this event. It'll also be hard to compete with Bitcoin's price appreciation. There are other assets, you know, for example, like real estate or gold that might be inflation protected, but you're not going to beat the return that Bitcoin has when Bitcoin flippins the US dollar. You know, this is a moment where you don't want to be holding anything traditional like that. You want to be holding Bitcoin. So I think the answer is, you want to be holding Bitcoin. That's the way to be the winner.
Could I just quickly ask about the intellectual class who seem, you know, very aligned with the fiat monetary system? They've attached their reputations to it. What happens to people like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini and Nassim Taleb?
I mean, the world could always use elementary math teachers. Hopefully, The tricky part, obviously, is, you know, the egos are going to stand in the way of doing productive work, because these are people who have spent their lives living off of printed money and not doing productive work. So it'll be interesting to see. I think it's going to be sad with many of these people, because they've staked their egos on the fact that Bitcoin needs to be wrong, and Bitcoin doesn't show any signs of dying or being wrong. So good luck to them.
I'm interested in what you guys think about Bitcoin's effect on culture, how it will affect things like art, how it will affect religion, how people think about society. I know you've written about this a little bit in your book, Safe, so maybe you can start us off, and I'll get these guys' opinions. We only have a little bit more time, but I'd love to hear what you think about how Bitcoin would change world culture.
I think it goes back to the issue I mentioned in the first question you asked me on time preference. I think ultimately, when people think about the long term, all decision making being geared to the long term ends up working out better in the long term on the average. And so you can see this reflected in everywhere. You can see it in terms of the food choices people take. You can see it in terms of the work that they do. Do people work in order to just get paid in the moment, or do they try and think of building something that matters for the long term? And you can see this in terms of art. In periods when we had hard money, art was built over a long time, and it required a lot of skill and dedication and craft in order to be built, and it lasted for a long time. And you see with easy money, the opposite happens. So it makes me very optimistic about Bitcoin, that we can think of really fiat as being the historical exception. All throughout human history, we've been finding harder and better money, and that's allowed us to save more for the future. That's allowed us to lower our time preference. That's allowed us to think more of the long term, and it's allowed us to accumulate more capital, accumulate more savings, and become more civilized. Essentially, this is a fundamental part of the process of civilization, is the ability to save money and the ability to lower time preference. And over the last century, humanity essentially took a massive hit to its effort to civilize itself, because its money stopped working. Its money started to lose value, and your ability to provide for the future became compromised. And I think, you know, this is really the legacy of fiat. I think the world that we live in today, the high time preference that we see pervasive in all kinds of human decision making all around, this I think is a function of fiat. And I discuss this in my forthcoming book, The Fiat Standard, or talk about this in depth. But I'm really optimistic that Bitcoin can bring us back to a process of civilization and lead to a human flourishing again, as we saw under the gold standard in many ways.
So we've run out of time, but I want to do a quick lightning round. I have 2 questions, and I want each of you to answer. When can we expect to see a hyper-Bitcoinized world? That's the first question. And what's one thing that you're most excited by under a Bitcoin standard? Parker, I'll start with you.
I'd say a decade. I think that based on how Bitcoin has been adopted historically, and based on the trillions of dollars that the Fed is going to have to print in the coming months, years, that it would potentially be conservative to say that Bitcoin's a unit of account in 10 years. And then the second question is, what am I most looking forward to? Bernanke and Yellen and Jay Powell and Krugman all being proven massively wrong. And I think that, I do think that, you know, what I love most about it is that what I said earlier, history will be written by the winners. It will not be kind to them. I think that they will be looked back on in history as some of the greatest fools that ever lived.
I'm going to be a little bit more conservative than Parker and say maybe 15 years, 16 years, you know, 4 more halving cycles. What I'm most looking forward to, I think, is just how amazing it's going to be to people to realize how much more prosperous humanity can be if we simply have this incredible technology of a money that is not devalued in order to finance government. I think people are going to be astonished at just how much higher standards of living can be all over the world. In particular in poor countries, when it just when people just can take this for granted, that they can save their wealth into the future and not have to worry about it, I think the impact is going to be absolutely amazing, and I really look forward to it. Also, in order to rub it in the face of the people who think that, you know, the fiat system is the best that we can do right now.
So I've got two answers for the first question. I would say at least a decade for hyper-Bitcoinization would be the most likely and actually conservative estimate. If we do have an event where there's rapid devaluation of fiat currency, the Bitcoin starts to surge or gets close to $1 million of Bitcoin, like a super cycle-esque moment, then we could see it much sooner, maybe 5, 6 years or so. But that would be a very unlikely outcome. I think it could happen. It's not likely to happen. And then what I'm most looking forward to is paying less taxes.
All right, thank you guys. That was awesome. It was great for me to get a chance to ask you these questions. I've wanted to ask you stuff like this for a long time. And thank you everyone for listening. I have launched my new book, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. I'll be selling just a few hundred copies as a pre-release in the Swan Dome at 2 p.m. today. So I hope to see you guys there. Thank you.